So we're going to start our conversation around the GWSRO character arc by looking at a concept that we call the given world. So at the top of the first box here, I'd just like you to write given world. Now, in a story, the given world has a very specific definition, and this is something that we're going to talk about pretty much any time that we are dealing with a work of fiction. So our definition of the given world is going to be the place and culture in which a story takes place, now keep in mind we're continuing this here, right? If we were to just say the place where a story happens and end it there, then really we're just talking about setting, really a small part of setting. But we're going to add a little more. You'll notice I put a comma there and not a period. So again, the place and culture in which a story takes place with all the norms, values, practices, and expectations that culture exposes and subjects characters to. That's our given world. So it's not just where the story happens, but also all of the social rules and the aspects of living in a given place that are imposed upon someone who is in that place. Now, a lot of the time this isn't an issue, right? For example, someone is born in the United States and grows up in the United States, and so a story about that person, the story of that person's life, is probably going to be a lot of them, living in their given world, right? And because they grew up in that place and they're comfortable with it, they don't necessarily struggle with the norms and values and practices and expectations of that given world. They're used to it. They grew up in it. We start to get issues where we have a story where maybe a character moves from one country to another country, or maybe they move from one school to another school, or maybe they they live with their family that is from one culture, and then they end up joining the wider culture that doesn't match that of their family. So in all of those cases, we end up with a contrast, a clash between an individual person's values and the way they understand that they should live, and the norms and expectations of the given world. Now, let me give you an example. Right, in Monkey Bridge, you had Tang, who was our character. Got to make sure I spell her name right here. We had Tang, a character, and some of the things she valued included the culture of Vietnam. So we could talk about specific meanings of hand gestures, and maybe some norms around shopping. And that is in contrast to, right, Thong's values. I'm going to add in Vietnam here to make sure it's clear. Thong's values, no E, Vietnam. Okay. Thong's values are in contrast to the values of the given world. Think for a moment about, based on this definition, based on what I've said so far, before I give you the answer. What is the given world in the excerpt of Monkey Bridge that we've talked about? What is the given world? All right, so our given world is, this is all Thong's values. Or instead of saying norms there, we can say expectations. So in contrast with that is the given world. Our given world is going to be, right, suburban American culture in the 1970s. Right, so by that, we're talking about, so that's like, so ways of shopping that are really different from those in Vietnam. And also the like hard scrutiny that some of you may have analyzed when working on your Monkey Bridge paragraph. That's like people just caring a lot about the way that you live your life and judging you if you don't live your life in this particular way. Like those are some of those values. And those are some of the values of the given world. That's really what the given world is in Monkey Bridge. And so you'll see this does not equal sign here. That's because the clash between Thong's like values and expectations was in conflict with the values of the given world, of the place and the culture that she was living in because she immigrated, right? And that caused conflict and struggle on Thong's part in that novel, in the whole novel, really, not just in the excerpt. Right, so that's our example of the given world and how that the values of the given world can conflict with the values of a single character in a story. So let me give you another example here, and this is an example that we're going to be working with a lot more coming up shortly. Before I do that, though, I'm going to make a little adjustment here to make our lives easier. I'm going to move some of this stuff. I'm going to just move it. All of this, I'm going to move it up a little bit so it's not in our way. There we go. Okay, so second example. An example given world value that we're going to be working with coming up soon with our next short story is something that is really highly valued in American culture, in the United States, sort of in Canada as well, maybe to a certain extent in Europe, especially in England, and not valued as much in other parts of the world. This given world value is individualism. That's the idea that like the basic unit of society is the individual. Individual people have the right to make their own decisions. people are not necessarily expected to put their their parents or their siblings in at a higher level than themselves and their own future life and economic gain, right? If, for example, many Americans, once they become adults and have stable careers and choose to have their own families, get married, have children, right? Often they don't feel necessarily responsible for taking care of their older parents, right? And that's why many older people, once they become too elderly to live on their own, end up going to like a nursing home or a senior facility, right? And that's because, right, there's no expectation in American society that a person puts aside their own individual goals to help even someone in their own family, let alone people that don't even know, right? So we call this is an individualistic way of looking at the world. A sort of version of that is independence, right? Individuals in America from a young age generally are expected to be a little bit more independent. It may be in recent years, some of this independence has been stripped away out of fear. But in general, right, many students are expected to, as young as, age 10 or 11, get themselves to school and back every day, as long as it's not too far away. They're expected to, in many cases, make 1 or 2 meals on their own each day while their parents are out working, taking care of younger siblings, that kind of thing, right? Those are, independence is instilled in young people from a very young age in American society. Now, the conflicting value and the value that kind of opposes that we find more predominant in other parts of the world, especially in Asia. So in China, in India, in Southeast Asia, right? This conflicting value we call interdependence. Or some people also call it, right, I'm actually going to move this here to make it clear. Some people call this interdependence as opposed to independence. And the kind of opposite of individualism in this case is collectivism. Living in a collective culture, right? Being your own individual economic gain is not the most important thing. The economic gain of your family or your community is the most important thing. So that's just a really different way of looking at the world. It's normal to rely on other people for everyday activities, right? You ask someone you know is in your family or local community makes meals for everyone on a regular basis, and you all eat together communally. You don't drive yourself, but you take public transit or you just have someone that that drives you places when you need to go places. Those kinds of things, right? It's just a really different way of looking at the world. So we have this example given world value and the conflicting value, and we're going to meet a character coming up soon. Her name is Mrs. Sen, who is from a fundamentally interdependent, collectivist community. And she has moved to the United States to a really, in the story, a kind of almost dramatically, individualistic, isolated, independence requiring part of the United States. And she, of course, is way out of her element. She's not used to that, and she's going to struggle with that. So that's actually where we're going to start. The next thing we're going to talk about here is the character arc. Right. So We talked about character arcs before. A character arc is really just a visual representation of the experience of a character as time goes on. Right? So, and it's drawn something like this, right? Where, and it just represents the character's change. So time is going this way, right? This is time. Right. And as time goes on, a character experiences some kind of change. You can shape these differently to represent, the character's overall situation becoming better or worse, but we're not going to really do that right now. Instead, we're just going to talk about how the conflict between an individual person's values and given world values can lead to struggle and push a story forward. So, the first part of the character arc is way over here, and we just call this struggle, as in the characters struggle with the given world value. Usually we just focus on one given world value, one idea, one thematic topic. So in this case, we're focused on the individualistic culture. In this case, it's going to be Mrs. Sen's struggle. Her name is Mrs. Sen. I'll write it down here. Mrs. Sen's struggle with the given world value, which in this case is going to be independence, or the individualistic culture. In fact, I'm going to write that instead, just to make sure it's really super clear. Part of the individualistic culture is being independent and doing things independently, even when you would actually rather, for whatever reason, rely on someone else to do that for you. And of course, they then rely on you to do things for them that maybe you're better at, that kind of thing. All right, so we have struggle, and that's our first piece. The next piece then is going to be, right, as a result of that struggle, people don't usually just roll over and accept discomfort, right? If they're in a place that is really uncomfortable for them, that contrasts with or conflicts with who they really are, they are going to try to fight back, right? They're going to try to respond to that in order to try to resolve the situation, to become, feel more comfortable in their place they're in the given world that they're in. So they will respond to that in some way. And we call this the initial response. So it's writing it all out. It's the initial response. I'm underlining this part to the character's struggle with the given world value. Right, that's our next piece. So the character responds in some way. They maybe are trying to fix the situation that doesn't feel right for them. Cool, that makes sense. They do that. All right. But that initial response in many stories doesn't necessarily go according to plan. It has results, often unpleasant results, or it has an effect that isn't what we really want. So we have an effect here. We're going to say the next piece of this character arc is the effect of the initial response to the character's struggle with the given world value. I'm actually going to underline all of this here. Not the whole thing, but the important part. Effect of the initial response. So, character struggles, they respond in some way to try to address the situation, to make it not quite so uncomfortable. The character now, but the world doesn't just change for the character automatically, right? That the social rules, cultural norms are well established. They're not just going to overturn themselves because one person wants them to. So that world is going to respond, right? It's going to talk back to that character. There's going to be some kind of opposing force. It's almost like physics, right? You push, the world pushes back. That is our effect of the initial response. So there's some effect. Usually it's not so great. It's a negative thing, a negative effect, a negative sort of way that the world returns the character's efforts. So then as time goes on, notice I'm leaving kind of a bigger gap here. Maybe the character tries to respond in a couple different ways, right? The character has an initial response that has an effect. And then they have another try to respond again based on that effect. And then there's another effect. Maybe it's a worse effect. And then eventually they get to a point where there is they've had enough and things have gotten worse because they've, constantly been struggling against this given world, right? And then they respond to the effect and it doesn't go well. And so then there's another effect and they respond to that and it doesn't go well. Eventually, the character will engage in some kind of ultimate response. So we're going to say, I'm going to put this up here just to make it clear. Up here. We'll say ultimate response to the effect, I'll put an S here, of the effects of the initial response to the struggle with the given world value. I know that's a mouthful. I know it's a lot of words, but it's actually really quite simple. Character has a struggle. They do something to fix it. It doesn't go well. The world responds. There is some negative effect of that attempt to sort of deal with their struggle. Sometimes there are multiple negative effects or multiple attempts to deal with the struggle and multiple negative effects as a result. Those lead to some ultimate response. This can often be big or dramatic, though not always. And then this ultimate response leaves the character somewhere, which we call outcome. It's just where the character ends up. Where the character ends up at the end of the story. Like, as a result of their ultimate response. So that's it. Those are our 5 pieces. Our 5 pieces are given world, Our initial response, given world. In a given world, the character experiences some struggle. They have an initial response and an effect that leads to an ultimate response that then ultimately results in an outcome. So that actually makes our acronym, GWSRO, Given World Struggle Response Outcome. There are simpler versions of this character arc. There are also more complex versions. For example, you can split the effect of one initial response into a short-term effect and a long-term effect. You can also condense initial response, effect, and ultimate response into just one big response. But I think that's a little too simplistic for 9th grade English. So we're going to do the 5-piece arc. So your task when reading Mrs. Sen's is going to be to pay attention for Mrs. Sen's struggle with the given world value of the individualistic culture in the United States. Right? Find examples of her struggle, what her initial responses are. There's a couple of them. What the effects of her initial responses are, like how does the world sort of respond to her actions? What ultimate response near the end of the story does she take? And where does that leave her at the very end? Ultimately, each one of these bullets becomes one body paragraph and in which you are analyzing each part of the character arc. And when you bring all of these pieces together and show how they convey a thematic message, a moral, a theme, then that is a literary analysis essay. And that's what you need to know how to do in 9th grade English. All right, so we're going to talk about one last little thing that is sort of connected. It's connected in the way that Mrs. Sen's is going, or that there are a lot of these things that we're about to talk about in Mrs. Sen's that I want you to be on the lookout for. And those are symbols. Many of you have likely looked at symbols before, but I want to make sure we have a chance to review them. So here is our clear definition of symbols. A symbol is a physical object or image that represents some abstract idea. This is a really general definition. When talking about literature, we could get more specific. We could add related to a character or setting. Usually the symbol is related to either the character or the setting or both. But if we zoom out and just think really generally, right? If I were to grab my red pencil here and draw an octagon like this, notice I'm not adding any words. I'm just drawing the shape. We can imagine that was all colored in red. I bet that you could tell me what that symbol represents, a red octagon. It has a meaning, an abstract meaning in our society, in our culture, right? And of course, that would be stop, right? If I draw something like, I'm going to get my original color back here. If I draw something like this symbol, you should be able to immediately recognize, right, what this is a brand symbol. I'm going to fix this here because it doesn't look quite right. This is a brand symbol. And it is a brand symbol for a car company, Toyota. Right? If you similarly, if you see an image of, I'm not an artist, but if you see an image of right? I'm not going to try drawing it, but if you see an image of a sort of sleek, flat apple with a bite taken out of it, you know that it immediately refers to Apple, the company. And then there's all of these associations related to like class and aesthetic beauty that come along with that. So those are some symbols we see in our world today. In literature, there are all kinds of symbols, right? Physical objects in a story are not just physical objects. They have meaning a lot of the time. And it's your job to identify which of those physical objects have meaning and which ones don't necessarily have any meaning. So for example, some things that you should pay attention to in Mrs. Sen's. Fish. What is that symbolic of? The boti. Right? What is the boti symbolic of? The knife. What does it represent? The car is definite. The car in Mrs. Sen's is symbolic. What does that represent? The apartment and specific stuff in the apartment. What do those represent? Right? All of those things, and there's lots and lots more. Jhumpa Lahiri is famous for abundant symbolism in her work. So pay attention for things that are symbolic in Mrs. Sen's. One more that just came to mind is the saris. What do those represent? Especially, not just generally, but in context of the story, what do the saris represent? Right, those are some things that you could think about. All right, that concludes our lesson for today.